I'm not thrilled with the idea of calling it a PR war. I use the term political war. It's PR almost sounds trivial, derivative. Political war has a more substantive and more threatening approach, which I think is more accurate. And it really began in, let's say, we can take November 29th, 1947. I think it became clear again in the most recent negotiations that John Kerry led, that the issue was, does Israel, or the rejection of Israel's legitimacy as a Jewish state has been the theme since 1947, as a state of the homeland of the Jewish people, a nation state like 28 Christian states in Europe and over 55 Islamic states. So the political war is saying Israel doesn't have the right to exist. The idea of a Jewish state is somehow in itself inherently apartheid, racist, genocidal, all those terms. When Israel defends itself, it's automatically human rights violations and war crimes. That's a political war. And it goes much beyond the PR element, and which I would say that the 2080 combination, one can argue different ways of looking at it, but I think that's the implication, that it's political. It's not just the way it's portrayed in the media, it's the way it is portrayed in the United Nations, it's the way it's portrayed by powerful groups that claim moral agendas, human rights groups, humanitarian aid groups. It's a very broad front, and we have to take it as that kind of attack and not simply saying if we had better spokespeople or better hasbara or better videos, that somehow we would solve the problem. It's much broader than that.
But there was a period, I mean, certainly through 67 and arguably until perhaps 1982, through the Lebanon War, where Israel enjoyed, I think, a great reputation internationally, where the kinds of issues that we're talking about today really didn't exist.
I think there are three important factors. Number one, Israel was an underdog. Israel was always on the edge of extinction until 1967. Was it Ephraim Kishon who wrote that piece, "Excuse Us for Winning"? That it would have been, we would have had a lot of sympathy if we would have been wiped out in 67, if Nasser had been able to push the Jews into the sea. So when you no longer are the miskein, the suffering, the threatened victim, and you become able to defend yourself, there also, I won't get into the theology of that, we just had the Pope there, and I think that's part of the Christian, very often a Christian perspective on that. But Jews were no longer threatened with being overthrown or thrown out. There's also the modern view that power is somehow, at least on campuses and on the left, as somehow being immoral. Israel had power, therefore it was acting immorally. The 82 war, I think, was also a major change, because there was this very visible use and to some degree an abuse of power. The scenes of Israeli aircraft bombing Beirut and the other things that happened there did cause you still see in many cases the change in the attitudes towards Israel and what was seen and could be argued as an excessive use of force, and we won't get into the whole plan that Sharon had and whether it was realistic or not, but it was not a war of self-defense, a war of survival. So that also contributed to that fact, to the way that Israel's seen. So I think there's something inherent in the process and the history of the events that led to the change in which Israel is seen today. The third point, which I want to come back to later, is that up until, let's say, when I was a kid, and Israel was still young, and through at least I remember 67 war was the first time I got involved in this as a high school kid, collecting money and doing what we call now hasbara on radio and helping people do that. But it was not something where Israelis and Jews said this was the role of the government. At least in what I remember in my image, this was every Jew, every Zionist was involved and was able to defend and not just defend, but actively promote Israel and the right of the Jewish people to self-determination and the reestablishment of Israel and our homeland and all of that. Somehow after 67, we became complacent as a community, and it was the job of the Israeli government, and so I'm preempting here. Somebody will always get up and say, or many people, why isn't the Israeli government doing a better job of doing hasbara? Well, I think that it can't be done well by government. It has to be done by everybody as an individual, and we lost that capability. We transferred that onto the government, and I think that was a mistake.